It's difficult to think of how you could describe that kind of politics of wanting to keep the slave trade open and not think of this man as somebody who's got deeply rooted racist ideas. There's a real dark side there, and people feel uncomfortable when they hear it. And I think it's because those sort of comfortable stories that people grow up with are challenged. It's hard to hear these things sometimes.
Professor Krista Petley, thank you very much for joining us today to talk about something that I think in the last decade or so has become quite prevalent in the media, and that's the remembrance and the commemoration of British imperial heroes who, for want of a better phrase, had a darker side to their character. And particularly today we'll be talking about how that sort of manifested itself in the advocacy of slavery in the Caribbean. I thought just before we get on to specific imperial heroes, if you'd like to just set the scene, as it were, and just explain how and why there was such fierce opposition to the abolition movement in the late 18th and early 19th century.
The main answer to that is extremely deep vested interests in people with a lot to defend in terms of the wealth that they had tied up in the slave system. So huge fortunes are built on sugar and slavery. But it's not just individual fortunes, and one of the most influential arguments of the pro-slavery lobby was to point out really that the slave system of the Caribbean was really closely entwined with a wider British imperial economy. So essentially Britain made money from slavery, and that meant taxing the trade in sugar, and as well as that, lots of profit from the sugar trade finds its way back into Britain through various different routes.
And you've particularly focused a lot of your research on a particular plantation owner, and that was a man called Simon Taylor. I wonder if you could just give a brief outline of who Simon Taylor was, because it then links us onto the British imperial hero that we're going to talk about.
Simon Taylor was one of the richest men in the British Empire by the time that he died in 1813. So he died with an estate valued at £1 million sterling, which was astronomical wealth for the early 19th century. And he'd risen to that position by being an incredibly successful plantation owner in Jamaica, where he owned thousands of enslaved people, doing the really arduous and exploitative work on his plantations to produce the plantation fortune that he amassed. And he was influential as well. So he was influential in Jamaica, a member of the Assembly and one of the leading voices there on the island. And also back in Britain, he participated in the debates about the slave trade and was part of the pro-slavery lobby that meant that the first wave of abolitionist campaigning in the late 1780s and early 1790s failed to achieve its goal of abolishing the slave trade. And when abolition did finally come around in 1807, he was absolutely apoplectic with rage at the decision.
Simon Taylor, of course, conversed through the letters that you have studied. You see he conversed with a lot of different plantation owners, but you see him also conversing with British imperial heroes, and specifically Admiral Lord Nelson, Horatio Nelson, obviously a figure that we within Britain admire today. But there was a letter that he received, Simon Taylor received from Horatio Nelson, which showed a slightly darker side to the imperial hero that we commemorate so much today.
Yeah, so Taylor met Nelson back in the late 1770s, when Nelson is posted to Jamaica as a young officer in the Royal Navy during the American Revolutionary War. And so the two of them, we know, make contact during that conflict, during Nelson's time in Jamaica. And that's nothing unusual for British admirals. to have had experience in the West Indies. The West Indies, after all, were the most profitable and important part of the empire in terms of their strategic significance. These are the most important colonies. So lots of Royal Navy officers spent time in the Caribbean. And so Taylor's relationship with Nelson isn't particularly unusual. There are lots of admirals. Lord Rodney is another good example, who had close relationships with sugar planters. And the two of them appear to have become friends when they met during the American Revolutionary War. And it appears from the surviving correspondence that they kept that connection up. And Nelson wrote to Taylor in the months leading up to his famous victory over the French at Trafalgar. And the letter that Nelson writes to Taylor shows that Nelson's quite sympathetic towards Taylor's political point of view regarding the slave trade. Nelson agrees with Simon Taylor that the slave trade shouldn't be abolished, it seems, from what he writes in this letter.
Yeah, and that sort of leads us on to the question of remembrance and commemoration. We see statues, place names, road names within the literature. People like Lord Nelson have been celebrated throughout British history for their heroic efforts in the war against Napoleon, in the Revolutionary Wars. Does this side to Nelson lead us to perhaps need to question why our commemoration and how we remember people such as Horatio Nelson, given his correspondence with plantation owners?
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, it's an overlooked part of Nelson's story, I suppose. It's one part of what is an incredibly complicated and rich life story in the case of Nelson, but nonetheless, it tells you something about him. He was very conservative in his outlook, and he writes to Taylor that he was born and bred, as he puts it, in the old school. He calls it the good old school, an old style of looking at the empire that valued the West India colonies, and he says that he'll do anything that's necessary to, I think he says, to raise his arm or his voice in defence of the West Indian interest. So he's very conservative, and it seems as though his views are shaped by those early connections with planters in the West Indies. And so clearly, he is sympathetic to the pro-slavery lobby. He's not an abolitionist, certainly not in that sense a progressive person politically. He writes very clearly that he doesn't like William Wilberforce and that he'll do what he can to oppose Wilberforce, who he describes as a hypocrite. So that's an important part of Nelson's story. It's part of it, that at least, part of what we know about Nelson that is often overlooked. And so perhaps it is something that usefully can be added to what we know about him.
Is it in your opinion that as long as we understand the nuances involved with his character and how he wrote and what his beliefs were, there's no need to, in the media there's all this talk of toppling statues. It's happened in America with some southern generals in the southern states. I was wondering if you had an opinion on that issue and whether having that knowledge is sufficient and there's no need to be toppling statues, etc.
Well, we tend to put these sort of national heroes literally, don't we, on a pedestal, and that means that oftentimes they're presented as spotless heroes, but that's perhaps not the way to see historical figures, because they're like you and me. They're complicated individuals and tainted individuals and people that are very much of their time in lots of ways. It's certainly the case for Nelson. So I think what's a problem is presenting anybody as being somehow spotless and whiter than white. Nelson, the person that could do no wrong, and clearly that's not the case. He had really questionable opinions, and he had these deeply prejudiced opinions about the continuation of the slave trade. It's difficult to think of how you could describe that kind of politics of wanting to keep the slave trade open and not think of this man as somebody who's got deeply rooted racist ideas, because advocating for the continuation of the slave trade means advocating for the continuation of the trafficking of enslaved Africans into this institution of slavery in the New World. And so these are things that we should know about and understand. And it's part of the context, I suppose, of making sense of the figure up there on the column in Trafalgar Square, that although he's presented up there as being this wonderful hero, he's got a complicated story, and he's a three-dimensional character.
And it's interesting that you also brought up his attitudes towards William Wilberforce, because in one of the articles I read, one of the arguments against toppling statues is William Wilberforce is perhaps the face of abolition to those who haven't studied it intricately. And yet he was someone who was not in favour of Catholic emancipation, for example. And it just, I guess that's another example of how everyone's complicated historic figures, and we need to understand the context of them. So I guess it shows as long as we have that knowledge of the nuances in their character, then there's no need to take further steps and further actions.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, I think it's an open question as to what you do with the sort of the monuments in the landscape, and whether it's something that you want to address by better educating people about those figures, or by removing or moving those monuments. And that's a very difficult set of questions. What do you do with this stuff that's left behind? That, if you like, it's part of the archaeology that surrounds us. It's part and parcel of the lived environment that we inhabit, and what we do with that is open for debate, I think. But the point you make about Wilberforce, I think also is true of Nelson. These are people that were of their time, complicated with a range of views. I mean, Wilberforce himself, although he advocates for the end of the slave trade, he comes quite late to the idea that slavery itself should be abolished. So he's got his own conservatism and prejudices as well. So these are for those sorts of reasons, these are quite complicated questions.
Slavery has been commemorated in so many ways, and the abolition especially, I think, within Britain has been commemorated. There have been steps taken to try to give us the bigger picture of the British involvement within the slave trade, and not just abolition. Do you think that's also very important for people to understand that we were part of this institution, we're a huge part of it, and simply celebrating abolition is not providing the full picture?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, one thing that we've got to think about in terms of the landscape of monuments that surround us is that this isn't a finished and closed sort of landscape. Let's add to it, and let's add to it and go forward in the ways that we want to. And I think one of the things that's absolutely lacking in Britain in the 21st century is a proper public memorial to slavery. We're quite good at celebrating. We're quite good at celebrating the military heroism of Nelson. That's what he's up there for, really. It's that he beat the French at Trafalgar. It's as a military hero, of people like him or Wellington, and of Wilberforce. There are statues to Wilberforce, and we're quite good at commemorating all of those positive things. But I think sometimes it's necessary too to memorialise and to remember that you used the phrase earlier in the conversation, these dark parts of history, and the dark parts of British history include this story of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, and we do very little to commemorate that. So as much as statues are there to celebrate, we also, I think, need monuments that commemorate, and at the moment we're not doing that very well. Hilary Mantel, who wrote Wolf Hall, that's being adapted for that TV drama, the Thomas Cromwell story. Yes. She's obviously a writer that's very interested in history, and she came up with this quote in her Reith lectures that I thought was really telling. She says that readers are touchingly loyal to the first history they learn. And if you challenge it, it's as if you're taking away their childhood. And sometimes I think that the response when you raise the dark side of Nelson's story, that he was a friend of slaveholders and that he was a pro-slavery advocate, people do feel as though you're somehow taking away something of their childhood. That very simplistic idea of Nelson as the man on the pedestal, this wonderful spotless hero. And somehow people have an emotional response when you say, no, he wasn't. He had a dark side. There are difficult parts of his story. There's parts of Nelson that you won't like and that aren't comfortable to hear about and that certainly don't sit at all well with any modern decent sensibilities when it comes to questions about slavery and race and racism. There's a real dark side there, and people feel uncomfortable when they hear it. And I think it's because those sort of comfortable stories that people grow up with are challenged. It's hard to hear these things sometimes.